On October 28, 2005, sacks of granulated sugar flowed out of the Western Sugar Company plant at Billings, Montana. 99 years ago, on October 28, 1906, sacks of granulated sugar flowed out of the Billings Sugar Company plant at Billings, Montana. In 1906, 55,200 tons were processed. In 2005, 314,807 tons were processed. While the computer age has drastically changed the operation of the processing plant, sugar is still extracted from sugar beets in much the same way it was 100 years ago. This is not as true, though, for the raising and harvesting of sugar beets. To understand this better, let's first look back at the history of the sugar beet factory. The 11th Territorial Assembly, which met from September 4, 1879 to February 21, 1879, passed an act that stipulated that 160 acres of land could be exempt from taxes for 6 years if a beet factory was built on it. In 1894, Montana State College was organized. S.M. Emery was appointed head of the Agricultural Experiment Station. The college brought in chemist F.W. Traphagen from the College of Montana at Deer Lodge. They distributed beet seed to volunteer farmers, mostly around Bozeman in 1895, and then over the whole state. The college in 1898 issued Montana Experiment Station Bulletin Number 19, written by Dr. Traphagen, entitled The Sugar Beet in Montana. This and additional bulletins numbered 33, 41, and 52, issued up until 1904, told of the results in their many field tests. By then they were saying production was no problem, all the state needed was factories. In 1904, the Billings Booster Club's business committee raised $12,000 by conscription to promote a factory. They hired F.M. Shaw, a promoter from Colorado, for $500 a month to sign up enough growers to raise about 6,000 acres of sugar beets in 1906. Then on March 14, 1905, I.D. O'Donnell, P.V. Moss, H.W. Rowley, M.A. Arnold, and F.M. Shaw incorporated the Billings Sugar Company. It was a closed corporation, with Moss investing $650,000 and the others $25,000 apiece. In 1906, the J.B. Kilby Company of Colorado bought 3.25 million bricks from the Slater Brick Company at 5th Street West and Grand Avenue in Billings and built the factory. It was a contract worth over $1 million. The Billings Sugar Company contracted then with farmers at $4.50 and $5 per ton to raise and deliver the beets to receiving stations. The sugar company then delivered the beets to the factory. The Great Western Sugar Company of Denver contracted to run the factory and manufacture the sugar. Beet pulp and molasses were byproducts of the factory, but at the start of 1906 there was no local demand for either. And in order to develop a market for them, $50,000 worth of sheep and cattle were purchased by the company and fattened for the commercial market. A lot of hand labor was necessary in the raising of the beets. They had to be planted and irrigated, thinned, hoed, pulled, piled, topped, loaded, and hauled to the beet dump. The very development of the Yellowstone Valley itself is an interesting history. On August 22, 1882, the Northern Pacific Railroad reached Billings, crossing the Yellowstone River. Incidentally, the bridge burned down a year later and had to be replaced. On July 1, 1882, just 6 years after the Custer Battle, the Minnesota-Montana Land and Improvement Company started the construction of the Big Ditch, the first large irrigation canal in the Yellowstone Valley. And over the next 20 years, many ditches were dug. The Canyon Creek Ditch, the Miller and McGurl Ditch, the High Line, the Cove, and the early 1900s, the Billings Land and Irrigation Company Canal. With the completion of the United States Reclamation Service project at Huntley about 1907, some 90,000 acres were put under irrigation. The sugar beet industry was poised for expansion. The company recruited German-Russian workers by running ads in Midwestern newspapers, and on March 1, 1906, about 35 German-Russians arrived in the Park City area to work in the fields. The factory brought in about 700 workers that first season and some 1,300 or 1,400 in 1907. The influx of people had a major impact on the local schools. The Elder Grove School had one room in 1904. The school added a second room in 1907 and a third in 1911, growing from 30 to 120 by 1913. 4-row planters sowing 15 to 20 pounds of seed per acre made it necessary to thin the stand so the beets would have room to grow. This was done by hand labor with short-handled hoes, and then weeds were removed during the summer with long-handled hoes. The farmers contracted all the hand labor for $20 to $22 an acre, and in some cases the labor leased the land, doing the entire planting, cultivating, and all the rest of the work for 2/3 of the total return. In the fall, the beets were pulled, piled, and topped. Originally 1-row pullers at first, similar to a walking plow, and then 2- and 3-horse teams depending on how dry it was. The beets were hauled with 4-horse teams and wagons, hauling 4 to 5 tons to the load in all kinds of weather. High-line receiving stations were situated every 5 to 6 miles on railroad sidings. If railroad cars were not available, the beets were shoveled off into a pile, and in the winter the farmers were hired to reload the beets and take them over to the dump. In the early days, the farmers were paid 10 cents a ton. In 1916, Great Western bought the Billings Sugar Company, and the company was dissolved in 1918. The GW brand remains until this day. The German-Russian farmers who came to the valley from 1906 on were thrifty and in time bought the farms and became the principal landowners. It then became necessary for the sugar company to bring in other types of labor. In 1918, they started bringing in Mexican labor. By 1930, the Great Western Sugar Company was processing 3,000 tons of beets per day and was the largest factory in the world. One of the first real changes in the harvesting of beets came when trucks were introduced. The Ford Motor Company advertised trucks for hauling beets in 1925. With the coming of World War II, labor became scarce. There were Filipinos, Mexican nationals, college students, and German and Italian prisoners of war brought in to thin and harvest the beets. Over the next 50 to 60 years, mechanization slowly took over the beet-raising business. Today, 12-row planters have supplanted the 4-row ones of 100 years ago. The same with 12-row cultivators. 6-row defoliators have replaced the 1-row pullers of the old days, and 6 to 8-row harvesters the beet fork. Now farmers use trucks that haul 20 tons instead of the wagons that were lucky to deliver 5 tons on net beets. The practice of surveying in ditches and the introduction of plastic tubes greatly reduced the labor requirements of irrigating. The computer age has taken over the processing at the sugar factory, as can be seen in this tour of the Western Sugar Factory in 2005.
Trucks carrying approximately 40-ton payloads are loaded at these sites 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as the factory is processing. Trucks are dispatched to piles for in-time delivery to the factory, so that once upon arrival, they can empty their load into the wet hopper. From there, they are carried into the factory by a water-filled flume. This begins the long process that is necessary to convert them into sugar. Rocks and debris are removed. Then the beets are washed. The beet washer deposits them on a long conveyor belt. Beets are elevated to the top of the factory to a holding tank that holds approximately 40 to 50 tons. The beets drop down to the slicer knives, where the beets are cut into shreds called cassettes. They are deposited on the cassette belt. The cassette belt carries the cassettes to the cassette mixer. Cassettes are mixed with hot water in a pre-cooking or blanching process and are then pumped to the bottom of the tower diffuser. Once inside the diffuser, large paddles push the mass of cassettes through the water toward the top. At the top of the diffuser, the sugar has been removed from the cassettes. Water is drained from cassettes. From here, the cassettes, now called pulp, will have more water removed at the presses. Even though the process has changed little, computers now play a huge role. The entire process can be controlled and monitored from this control room. Speeds, levels, temperatures from throughout the factory can be observed from here. Parameters are constantly monitored. Slicers, mixer, diffuser, filters, evaporators, centrifugals, presses, dryer, sugar bins, bulk car loading can all be monitored from this central location. Samples are taken from various parts of the process and sent to the lab in order to constantly monitor concentrations of sugar, pH, and purities. After the juice leaves the diffuser, it goes to the main limer and is mixed with milk of lime, then to first carbonation, where it is mixed with carbon dioxide. Here, and in the clarifier, calcium carbonate precipitates and settles out along with most of the impurities. It then goes to second carbonation for more impurity removal, and then on to the evaporators, where the process of removing the water begins. Then on to the white pan, next to the centrifugal, and on to the granulator, and then to storage. Sugar is constantly being recovered. Here, sugar-containing water is removed from calcium carbonate that is settled out in the clarifier. Thin juice is thickened in a process in which water is boiled off in a series of successive vessels called evaporators. The juice is further thickened when it reaches the white pan floor, and sugar crystals form, and the resulting product is called massicate. The massicate is now spun out, where centrifugal force removes molasses from the sugar crystals. This molasses is further crystallized, and more white sugar is removed from the molasses in successive processes. Crystallized sugar is dried and cooled in the granulator before going to the warehouse or storage. Up until now, the process of getting sugar out of the beets has taken 24 to 36 hours. During the process, the warehouse and sugar bins fill to capacity. In the warehouse, sugar is packaged in many different types of consumer and commercial-sized packages. Here, the FOEMA packaging line is packaging 2-pound GW sugar packages for sale in grocery stores. Sugar is not the only final product. While we left the diffuser to see juice made into sugar, pulp from the diffuser was headed to presses where water is squeezed out of the pulp. This pulp can then be fed to cattle in feedlots. Pulp that is not fed directly to cattle in feedlots is dried to about 10% moisture, where molasses is added and made into pellets that can be shipped around the country and the world, where it is used in various animal feeds ranging from dairy cattle to dog food. The sugar beet has made its long journey, and it definitely is a sweet story.
This spring of the year 2006, farmers and Western Sugar Company are starting the second 100 years of the sugar beet in Montana. With a rich and colorful century behind us, who knows what the future will bring?